It was a warm July evening when I found myself driving along Route 87, a lonely stretch of highway slicing through the heart of Arizona's desert. I was on my way to visit my sister in Flagstaff, a good 3-hour drive from where I lived. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the road ahead seemed endless, illuminated only by the faint glow of my headlights and the silvery sheen of the moon. I was no stranger to long drives. They always brought me a strange kind of peace, the hum of the engine, the open road, the solitude. But that night, the road felt different. I can't explain it, but there was a tension in the air, an unsettling stillness that pressed against my chest like a weight. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. A single set of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, slowly gaining on me. It wasn't unusual for cars to pass by, even at this late hour, but what caught my attention was how erratic the lights seemed. Zigzagging slightly, dimming and brightening, as if the driver couldn't decide whether to pass or tailgate me. I shook it off as a careless driver or someone tired like me. Still, I kept an eye on the mirror. The car crept closer until it was practically riding my bumper. The glare of its headlights flooded my car, casting sharp, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. My grip on the wheel tightened, and I muttered under my breath, "What's your problem?" Then, as suddenly as the car had appeared, its headlights vanished. I blinked, glancing back, certain I must have imagined it. But the rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness. No screeching tires, no sudden turnoffs, just an empty highway stretching behind me. A chill crept up my spine, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the driver had turned off onto one of the dirt roads, though I hadn't noticed any exits. I cranked up the music on the radio, hoping to drown out the unease gnawing at me. Another 20 minutes passed uneventfully. I started to relax, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. But then, out of nowhere, my radio cut to static. The music fizzled, replaced by a sharp, grating hiss. I fiddled with the dial, trying to find another station, but the static persisted. Over the noise, I thought I heard something. A faint voice, distorted and low, whispering words I couldn't quite catch. I turned the radio off completely, my pulse quickening. The quiet was almost worse. It felt heavy, oppressive, as if the night itself was pressing in on me. I glanced at the passenger seat, where a small stuffed bear, something my niece had left in my car, sat lifelessly. Its glassy eyes seemed to stare back at me accusingly. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road, illuminated briefly by my headlights. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, but something about them wasn't right. Their posture was stiff, unnatural, and their head hung at an odd angle, as though their neck couldn't support its weight. They were wearing a white dress that looked old, tattered, and stained with something dark. I felt a jolt of fear as I sped past, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but the figure wasn't there. It hadn't been long enough for them to disappear out of sight. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. A few miles later, my headlights flickered. Just once. Then again. The fear I'd been trying to suppress surged back. I cursed under my breath, trying to stay calm, when the headlights went completely dark. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the highway. The desert night swallowed me whole. No streetlights, no moonlight, just an impenetrable blackness. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for its tiny screen's glow. As I unlocked it, a notification popped up. No signal. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. It came from the back window. My blood turned to ice. Every nerve in my body screamed at me not to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I twisted in my seat and looked. There was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at my own imagination. Then the tapping came again, louder this time from the driver's side window. I whipped my head around. A face was pressed against the glass, pale, hollow-eyed, with a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, as if it would tear the skin. The figure's neck was bent at that same impossible angle, and their white dress hung in tattered shreds. I screamed, fumbling to start the car. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I tore down the highway. The face vanished, but I didn't dare look back. The road seemed endless, the darkness impenetrable. Every shadow felt alive, every sound amplified. I was running on pure adrenaline, my knuckles white on the wheel. Then in the distance, I saw lights, bright, artificial, and welcoming. A gas station. I pulled in so fast I nearly crashed into the pump. I stumbled out of the car, my legs trembling, and ran inside. The fluorescent lights were a harsh contrast to the night, but I welcomed them. The cashier, a bored-looking guy in his 20s, raised an eyebrow at me. Everything okay?" he asked. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. There's something out there," I stammered. Something, on the highway." He frowned, glancing out the window. "Highway's pretty dead this time of night. You sure you weren't seeing things?" Before I could answer, a car pulled into the station. It was the same one that had been tailing me earlier. My stomach dropped as the driver stepped out. It was a man, but his movements were jerky, almost robotic. His face was hidden under the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel his eyes on me. He walked into the station without a word, his boots clicking against the tile floor. The cashier didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, every instinct telling me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The man stopped a few feet away, tilting his head as if studying me. Then, in a voice that sounded like gravel scraping metal, he said, "You should have stayed on the road." The lights flickered, and when they came back on, he was gone. I didn't finish the drive that night. I called my sister from the gas station, begging her to come get me. When she arrived, I tried to explain, but the words felt hollow, like a bad dream I couldn't shake. I've never driven Route 87 at night again. Some nights, though, I wake up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know better.
Story number 2.
I never believed in ghost stories, not until I became one. And the cruel irony is, I'm not even sure how it happened. All I know is that I was alive one moment and gone the next. It started, as most tragedies do, on an ordinary night. I was driving through West Virginia, a state I knew for its dense forests and winding roads. I'd taken a shortcut through the mountains to save time on my way home. It was past midnight, and the highway was desolate. My car's high beams were the only light cutting through the oppressive darkness of the narrow 2-lane road. The air felt heavier the higher I climbed, and the static on my radio seemed to grow louder, like a faint, crackling whisper that danced in the background of the music. I chalked it up to interference from the mountains and turned the volume down. About 30 minutes in, I saw something on the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing in the middle of the road, dressed in a tattered gray suit that looked decades out of place. His head hung low, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide, floppy hat. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop just feet from him. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He didn't flinch, didn't move. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, lowering my window just a crack. He didn't respond. Slowly, he lifted his head, and I saw his face, or rather, the lack of it. His skin was pale, stretched tight over bone, and where his eyes should have been, there were only hollow, gaping sockets. His mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, as if he were screaming silently. My hands fumbled for the gear shift, and I reversed as fast as I could. But as I tried to maneuver around him, he vanished, gone as if he had never been there. My headlights illuminated nothing but the empty road. I was trembling, my mind racing for a rational explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. That's what I told myself anyway. I kept driving, my eyes darting nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. The static on the radio grew louder, the whispers more distinct. I could almost make out words, faint, fragmented phrases. "Leave. Turn back. Not safe." I turned the radio off, but the whispers persisted. They seemed to come from inside the car now, echoing faintly in the cabin. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of something tapping on the car. Tap! Tap! It was coming from the passenger side window. My chest tightened as I turned my head slowly. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, in the faint moonlight, I saw a hand pressed against the glass, pale, skeletal, with fingers that seemed too long, too thin. I screamed, scrambling to lock the doors, but the locks clicked on their own, sliding open instead of closed. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was outside was trying to find a way in. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping each other in a chaotic, maddening cacophony. "She's ours now. Can't escape. Don't fight it." Suddenly, the car started up on its own. The headlights flared back to life, but instead of illuminating the road, they lit up a figure standing directly in front of me. It was the man in the gray suit. Only now his head was twisted at an unnatural angle and his mouth was still gaping open, emitting a soundless scream. The car began to move, but I wasn't touching the gas pedal. The steering wheel jerked on its own, turning the car off the road and onto a dirt path that hadn't been there before. I yanked at the wheel, desperate to regain control, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, and cruel. Shadows danced in the periphery of my vision, darting between the trees that lined the path. The car came to a sudden stop in front of an old, decrepit house that seemed to rise out of the ground like a jagged wound. Its windows were shattered, the front door hanging off its hinges. A sense of dread washed over me, so heavy it was almost suffocating. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, the car doors unlocked and swung open on their own. I didn't want to get out, but my body moved against my will, my legs carrying me toward the house. The air was cold, colder than it should have been in July, and it smelled of decay. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I stepped onto the rotting porch. The door creaked open before I could touch it, revealing a dark, yawning void inside. I don't remember much of what happened next. Flashes of images, fragments of sounds, a woman's scream, the feeling of hands grabbing me, pulling me down into a darkness so absolute it felt alive. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked on the side of the highway. The sun was rising, casting a soft golden light over the landscape. At first, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I noticed the dirt under my fingernails, the scratches on my arms, the faint smell of decay that clung to my clothes. I started the car and drove home, but I've never been the same. Every now and then I hear whispers, faint and distant, but unmistakable. And sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I see a figure in a gray suit standing by the side of the road watching me. I don't know what they want, but I know one thing for certain, they're not done with me yet.
Story number 3.
I used to deliver goods late at night for a small trucking company. It was quiet work, long stretches of empty highways and the hum of the engine as my only companion. But there was one route, one stretch of road I'll never drive again. It was a job like any other, a shipment of farm supplies headed to a town deep in the rural Midwest. The route took me through stretches of farmland, a long, isolated road flanked by miles of fields. The dispatcher warned me before I left, "Watch out for Fog Hollow. Locals say it's cursed." I laughed it off. Every small town has its ghost stories, right? I didn't give it a second thought until I was about halfway into the trip. That's when the fog rolled in. It started as a thin mist swirling in the headlights, but within minutes it thickened into an impenetrable wall, swallowing the road. I slowed down, leaning forward to squint through the windshield, but the fog was so dense I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The radio, which had been playing faint static, cut out completely. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rumble of the truck's engine and the occasional squeak of the windshield wipers. I was alone in a sea of gray, the world outside reduced to shadows and vague shapes. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from them. My heart pounded as I stared at the figure through the windshield. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown that billowed unnaturally in the still air. She didn't move. Her head was tilted downward, her face obscured by a curtain of long, dark hair. Something about her was wrong. Her silhouette was too still, too rigid, like she wasn't entirely real. I rolled down the window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. Slowly, she lifted her head and I saw her face, or rather, the lack of one. Her features were twisted, blurry, like an image smeared on glass, but her eyes were black voids, endless and empty. Before I could react, she moved. Not walked, not ran, moved. One moment she was standing in front of the truck, and the next, she was at my window, her faceless head pressed against the glass. A faint whisper filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Help me," the voice said. It wasn't hers. It was layered, overlapping voices, men, women, children, all pleading in unison. I screamed, slamming the truck into reverse and flooring the gas. The truck lurched backward and the figure vanished, swallowed by the fog. My hands trembled on the wheel as I turned the truck around, desperate to get out of Fog Hollow. But the road didn't lead back the way I'd come. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't find the highway. The fog seemed endless, the road looping in on itself. My GPS was useless, the screen flickering with static. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt warped, stretched thin like the fog itself. I began to notice things outside the truck, shapes moving in the fields, shadows darting across the road. At one point, I thought I saw someone running alongside the truck, their twisted face illuminated by the headlights for a brief, horrifying moment. I stopped looking after that. Eventually, the road led me to a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated farmhouse, its windows dark and empty. The truck engine sputtered and died as I pulled up, leaving me in deafening silence. I didn't want to get out, but something compelled me. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the house. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The door creaked open as I approached, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with peeling wallpaper and faded photographs. The faces in the pictures were scratched out, leaving only silhouettes. I should have turned back, but I couldn't. Something was drawing me deeper into the house. I stepped into the living room, where a single candle flickered on a wooden table. Around it sat 4 chairs, each occupied by a figure. They were motionless, their heads bowed, their clothes old and tattered. At first, I thought they were mannequins, but then one of them turned their head toward me. Its face was a patchwork of human features, eyes too close together, a mouth too wide, stitched together like a grotesque quilt. "Sit," it rasped, its voice a guttural croak. I backed away, but the room seemed to shift, the walls closing in. The shadows grew darker, longer, reaching for me. "You've come too far." Another voice said, this one soft and childlike, "You can't leave now." I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the creaking floorboards. The house seemed endless, a maze of twisting hallways and staircases that led nowhere. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself outside. The fog was still there, thicker than ever, but the truck was gone. In its place was a graveyard, rows of weathered headstones stretching into the mist. I stumbled through the graves, my breath ragged, until I saw it, my name etched into a stone. Below it was today's date. The whispers turned into laughter, echoing through the fog. Shadows closed in around me, and the last thing I remember is a cold hand gripping my shoulder, pulling me into darkness. I woke up hours later, parked at a truck stop miles from Fog Hollow. My dispatcher was furious, demanding to know why I disappeared and why the shipment hadn't been delivered. I didn't have an answer, but every now and then I catch a glimpse of the fog in my rearview mirror, creeping closer, and I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again.
Story number 4.
The night it happened, I was heading home from a friend's wedding in the countryside. It was a beautiful, intimate affair, but it had run later than expected. By the time I left, the moon hung high in the sky and the roads were deserted. The drive back to the city would take about 3 hours, most of it through dense forest and winding roads. I wasn't worried. I'd made the trip before, but something about that night felt different. The air seemed thicker, the shadows cast by my headlights darker, deeper. I was about an hour into the drive when I noticed the first oddity. The temperature in my car began to drop, despite the summer heat outside. I reached for the AC controls, but it was already off. A shiver ran down my spine as I glanced at the dashboard, where frost had started to creep across the edges of the glass. It didn't make sense, but I brushed it off, assuming my tired mind was playing tricks on me. I turned up the heater, hoping to chase away the chill, and focused on the road ahead. Then I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing on the shoulder of the road, her back to me. A woman in a tattered black dress, her long hair matted and wild. She didn't move as my car approached, and I slowed down instinctively, my heart pounding. I rolled down my window slightly as I pulled up beside her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I called out, trying to sound calm. She didn't respond. She didn't even turn to look at me. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Something about her felt wrong. The way she stood, so unnaturally still, like a statue. And the air around her, it felt heavy, suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Before I could say anything else, she turned. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the moonlight, but it was her eyes that froze me in place. They were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull at my very soul. Her lips twisted into a smile, wide and unnatural, revealing teeth that were sharp, jagged. "Help me," she whispered, her voice faint but carrying an edge that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't wait to see what she'd do next. I slammed the car into drive and sped off, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the middle of the road, watching me, and then she began to run. She moved impossibly fast, her figure growing larger in the mirror. I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as the car sped down the narrow road. But no matter how fast I went, she kept pace, her face twisted into that horrific smile. The fog rolled in suddenly, thick and white, obscuring everything except the faint glow of my headlights. I couldn't see her anymore, but I could feel her presence like a weight pressing against my chest. And then came the laughter. It started soft, a faint giggle that seemed to echo all around me, but it grew louder, more manic, until it filled the car. It wasn't just her laughing. It was a chorus of voices, men and women, young and old, all blending into a horrifying symphony of madness. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and whispered to myself, "It's not real. It's not real." But then the laughter stopped, replaced by a single voice. Hers. "You can't run forever." Her voice came from the back seat. I nearly swerved off the road as I glanced over my shoulder, but the back seat was empty. The air inside the car was freezing now, my breath visible in the dim light. I turned my eyes back to the road, just in time to see a figure standing in the middle of it. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt, but it was too late. There was a sickening thud, and the car shuddered as if it had hit something solid. I sat there trembling, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. My headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. No body, no blood, nothing. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that she was gone. But then the car engine died, plunging me into silence. The lights flickered and went out, leaving me in darkness. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. The only sound was my ragged breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it, a soft tapping on the driver's side window. My stomach dropped, and I turned my head slowly. She was there, her hollow eyes staring at me through the glass, her lips twisted into that same horrific smile. Her hand pressed against the window, leaving a smear of something dark and oily. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as she leaned closer, her mouth moving as if whispering something. I couldn't hear her words, but they filled my mind. A torrent of images and sounds, screams, fire, faces contorted in agony. It was too much. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands over my ears, and screamed. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The fog had lifted, and then the car started on its own, the headlights flickering back to life. I didn't question it. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the city limits. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on that road. I've searched for stories, asked locals about the area, but no one will talk about it. They only tell me one thing: stay off that road at night.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be an ordinary road trip. My friend Luke and I had planned the drive for weeks, a scenic route through the Appalachian Mountains with plenty of roadside stops and stunning views. We didn't think twice about taking Route 47, an old highway that had fallen into disrepair over the years. Locals referred to it as the Vanishing Stretch, but we thought it was just a nickname for its remoteness. If only we'd listened. The first half of the drive was uneventful. The road twisted through dense forests, sunlight filtering through the trees. We passed the occasional abandoned gas station or boarded-up diner, but nothing unusual. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were deep in the mountains, and the road was empty except for us. The first sign of trouble came around 9 p.m. The radio cut out, filling the car with static. Luke fiddled with the dials, trying to find a signal, but it was no use. Every station was the same, a faint, crackling hiss. "Must be the mountains messing with the signal," Luke said with a shrug. I nodded, but something about the static unsettled me. It wasn't just random noise. There was a rhythm to it, like faint whispers trying to form words. I turned it off, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the static. A few miles later, we saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, her back to us, dressed in a pale, tattered dress that looked like it belonged in another century. Her hair was long and tangled, and she was barefoot, her feet dirty from the gravel. "Is she hitchhiking?" Luke asked, slowing the car. "I don't think so," I said, watching her closely. Something about her posture, too rigid, too unnatural, made my stomach twist. As we passed, she turned her head to look at us. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they weren't right. They were wide and dark, like twin voids that seemed to pull the light from the air. Luke cursed under his breath and hit the gas. The car surged forward, and the woman disappeared from view. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I don't know, I said, my voice shaky. But let's not stop to find out. We drove in tense silence for the next few miles, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding endlessly through the trees. I checked my phone for a signal, but there was none. The GPS was stuck, the screen frozen on a blank map. That's when the car began to sputter. No, 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 Luke muttered, tapping the gas pedal. The engine coughed and the headlights flickered. What's wrong? I asked, panic rising in my chest. I don't know. It was fine a minute ago. The car rolled to a stop, the engine dead. We were alone on an empty highway, miles from the nearest town. The forest pressed in on us, the trees casting long, jagged shadows under the moonlight. Luke tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't start. He swore and slammed his fist on the dashboard. We'll have to walk, he said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. I didn't like the idea, but staying in the car didn't feel any safer. We grabbed our phones, even though they were useless, and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and carried a faint, metallic scent. We hadn't gone far when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from behind us, growing louder with each step. Do you hear that? I whispered. Luke nodded, shining the flashlight behind us. The beam illuminated the empty road, but the tapping continued, closer now. We picked up our pace, the sound following us. It wasn't until we reached a bend in the road that we saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, facing us this time, her head tilted to one side, her dark eyes fixed on us. Don't move, Luke whispered, but my legs were already frozen in place. She took a step forward, then another, her bare feet making that eerie tapping sound on the asphalt. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and wrong, like a puppet being dragged on strings. Luke grabbed my arm and pulled me off the road into the trees. We stumbled through the underbrush, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind us, the tapping turned into a low, guttural hum, a sound that didn't belong in this world. We ran until our lungs burned, the forest swallowing us. When we finally stopped, the humming had faded, replaced by the oppressive silence of the woods. We need to keep moving, Luke said, his voice trembling. But before we could take another step, the flashlight flickered and went out. The darkness was absolute, smothering. I reached out for Luke, but my hand found nothing but empty air. Luke, I called, panic tightening my throat. No response. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint and close. Help me. I turned, and there she was, standing inches from me. Her face was twisted into a grotesque smile, her empty eyes boring into mine. I screamed, stumbling backward, but she didn't move. She just stood there, whispering those two words over and over again. And then I blacked out. When I came to, I was lying on the side of the road, my head pounding. The car was gone, and so was Luke. My phone had a signal now, and the sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the empty highway. I called the police, but they never found any trace of Luke or the car. I don't drive that stretch of road anymore, and I never go out after dark. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that soft, rhythmic tapping outside my window, and I know she hasn't forgotten me.
Story number 6.
It was a quiet autumn evening when I first encountered the house. I was on a back road in Pennsylvania, taking a shortcut I didn't normally use. The air was crisp, the leaves a fiery mix of red and orange, and the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold. I'd left work late and was eager to get home. The route was unfamiliar, but seemed straightforward enough. Just follow the winding road through the woods until it connected to the main highway. About halfway through the drive, I saw it. A house, tucked away in the trees. It was old, Victorian style, with peeling paint and sagging shutters. It seemed abandoned, yet a single light glowed faintly in an upstairs window. I felt a strange pull as I passed it, a gnawing curiosity that made me slow down. But as I got closer, the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. My chest tightened and a chill ran down my spine. I sped up, trying to shake the unease, but when I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw the light in the window flicker, and a figure standing there, watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been working long hours, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure, the way it seemed to follow me with its gaze. The road stretched on, dark and empty, the forest closing in on either side. The radio was on, but the static was growing louder, drowning out the music. I adjusted the dial, but no matter what station I tried, the static remained. Then it stopped. The silence was deafening, and I swear I heard breathing. Not mine, but something else, soft and raspy. I glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see someone sitting there. Of course, it was empty, but when I turned back to the road, my headlights illuminated a woman standing in the middle of it. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She just stood there, her head tilted to the side, her long, dark hair covering her face. My heart pounded as I rolled down the window just enough to call out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. Slowly, she lifted her head and I saw her face, or rather, what was left of it. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with deep, jagged scars running down her cheeks. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light. I threw the car into reverse, but before I could move, she was at my window. Her hands, skeletal and clawed, pressed against the glass, leaving smudges of something dark and oily. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like wind through dead leaves. I screamed, flooring the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, and she vanished, swallowed by the darkness. I drove as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that she was still there, just out of sight. The road seemed endless, looping back on itself. I passed the same tree, the same curve, the same rusted road sign over and over again. My GPS was useless, the screen flickering with static. Finally, I saw it. The house. I was back where I'd started, the old Victorian looming in the trees. The light in the upstairs window was gone, but the front door was open, swinging gently in the wind. I didn't want to stop, but the car sputtered and died as I approached the house. The headlights dimmed and the air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath. I tried the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. My phone had no signal, and the radio was still nothing but static. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the back seat. I froze, my hands gripping the wheel. Slowly, I turned my head. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her hollow eyes staring at me through the rearview mirror. "Help me," she whispered again, louder this time, her voice echoing in my ears. I scrambled out of the car, stumbling onto the gravel driveway. The tapping continued, even though I was outside. It grew louder, faster, more insistent. The front door of the house creaked open wider, as if inviting me in. I knew I shouldn't go inside, but something compelled me to move. My legs felt heavy, as if they weren't entirely my own, dragging me toward the house. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the floors creaked under my weight. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I followed it to the staircase, which led to the second floor. Each step groaned as I climbed, the hum growing louder with every step. At the top of the stairs, I found myself in a long hallway. Doors lined either side, most of them ajar, revealing dark, empty rooms. But one door at the end of the hall was closed. The hum was coming from behind it. I didn't want to open it, but my hand moved on its own, turning the knob. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon through the cracked window. In the center of the room stood a chair, and in the chair sat the woman. She was staring at me, her hollow eyes glinting in the dim light. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that were sharp and uneven. "You came back," she said, her voice layered with echoes as if a dozen people were speaking through her. I tried to step back, but the door slammed shut behind me. "You can't leave," she said, rising from the chair. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The room grew colder, the walls seeming to close in, shadows wreathed and stretched, reaching for me. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road, my car parked nearby. The engine started without a problem, and the GPS worked again, guiding me back to the highway. I told myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping on my windows, and I know she's still waiting for me.
Story number 7.
I was driving home late one night from a family reunion in a rural part of North Carolina. The road was quiet, long stretches of empty asphalt winding through the dark countryside. It was one of those nights where the moon was hidden behind thick clouds and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I'd taken this road many times before, but something about it felt different that night. Quieter, like the world was holding its breath. The air in my car was stifling, even though I had the AC running. About an hour into the drive, my phone buzzed. I glanced down to see an alert. Severe weather warning, fog advisory in effect. I rolled my eyes, thinking nothing of it, But within minutes, the road ahead began to disappear under a thick blanket of fog. It crept in slowly at first, swirling like smoke, until it became so dense I had to slow to a crawl just to stay on the road. As the fog grew heavier, I started to feel uneasy. My headlights seemed to be swallowed by the mist, barely illuminating a few feet in front of me. That's when I saw her. At first, it was just a shape, a vague outline of a figure standing on the side of the road. As I got closer, the figure became clearer. A young woman in a long white dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders in tangled waves. She was barefoot and her arms hung limply at her sides. I slowed the car, rolling down the window just enough to call out, "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" She turned to face me, and my breath caught in my throat. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were impossibly wide, as if frozen in a permanent expression of terror. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I froze, unsure what to do. She took a step toward the car, and I noticed something odd. Her movements weren't smooth. It was as if she were a marionette, her limbs jerking unnaturally with each step. Then she spoke. "Help me," she said, her voice a faint whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I didn't know what else to do, so I nodded and unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in without a word, her dress brushing against my arm as she settled into the seat. The air in the car grew colder immediately, so cold I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head slowly to look at me, her wide eyes glinting in the dim light of the dashboard. "Turn left," she said. Her voice was hollow, almost mechanical, but I obeyed. I didn't know why, I just did. The road she directed me onto was narrow and winding, the trees on either side forming a canopy that blocked out what little light there was. The fog seemed thicker here, pressing against the windows like a living thing. "Where are we going?" I asked, glancing over at her. She didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "Stop here." I pulled over, the tires crunching on gravel. We were in front of an old, crumbling house. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and the porch steps had rotted away. "This is where it happened," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She opened the car door and stepped out, her bare feet silent on the gravel. I hesitated, but something compelled me to follow her. She led me toward the house, her movements slow and deliberate. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence was deafening. When we reached the front door, she stopped and turned to face me. "They buried me here," she said, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. "They thought no one would find out." Before I could respond, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark, gaping void. She stepped inside, and I followed, my heart pounding. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. The walls were covered in strange, dark stains, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. The air smelled of decay, and I had to fight the urge to gag. She led me to the basement, the stairs creaking ominously as we descended. At the bottom, the air was so cold it felt like knives against my skin. She stopped in the center of the room and pointed to the ground. "Here," she said. I looked down and saw it, a patch of dirt, darker than the rest, as if it had been disturbed recently. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Help me," she said again, her voice cracking. I didn't know what else to do, so I started digging with my hands. The dirt was cold and damp, and the deeper I went, the more I felt like I shouldn't be doing this. And then I found it. A skeletal hand, twisted and broken, sticking out of the ground. I scrambled back, my heart racing, but the woman knelt beside the grave. "They left me here," she said, her voice full of sorrow. "They thought no one would care." As I watched, her form began to change. Her once beautiful dress darkened and tattered further, her skin taking on a bluish hue. Her eyes sank deeper into her skull, and her voice grew colder. "They were wrong," she said, turning to face me. Her mouth twisted into a horrific smile, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I stumbled back, tripping over a broken floorboard. She rose to her feet, her movements jerky and unnatural, and began to advance toward me. I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The house seemed alive, the walls groaning and the floorboards shifting beneath me. I burst out the front door and into the foggy night, not stopping until I reached my car. I jumped in, locking the doors and fumbling with the keys. When the engine roared to life, I looked back at the house. She was standing in the doorway, her hollow eyes watching me. As I sped away, the fog began to lift, and the road ahead became clear again. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, She was sitting in the back seat, her twisted smile reflected in the glass. I screamed, swerving off the road and into a ditch. When I looked back again, she was gone. I never took that road again, but sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I catch a glimpse of her in the mirror, always watching, always waiting.